Welcome to the Cereneuro Journal Club, where we explore the latest and emerging scientific evidence in neurorehabilitation. Our mission is to bridge the gap between the lab and clinical practice, empowering therapists and patients with knowledge that can truly improve lives.
Thank you, Bernat, for the invitation. It is really a pleasure to talk in cereneuro, to have this journal club with you. And today, Bernat selected this paper that you can see in the presentation, in the slide, that refers to the application of Prism adaptation combined with cognitive training for rehabilitation of visual-constructive apraxia. It is part of a research journey, as anticipated by Bernat, that I started in the last years in the attempt to find out new approaches for neuromodulation in stroke patients, not as an alternative, but as a complementary approach to other neuromodulation tools like TMS or TDCS. In particular, here we refer to visual constructive abilities that refer to the abilities, as you know, to assemble the elements of two or three-dimensional objects while maintaining their orientations and spatial relationships. This ability is usually tested in neuropsychology with figure copying tasks. And impairment of this visual constructive ability is called constructional apraxia. It is frequently observed in stroke patients. The prevalence ranges between 15 and 40% of patients with stroke, either with left or right stroke, with different characteristics we can discuss later if you want. And the impact of this deficit is quite huge, and it transfers to everyday life activities, so to activities of daily living, like dressing, grooming, and so on, and the ability basically to properly use objects. On the other hand, there is a problem in rehabilitation. So despite this quite high prevalence, 80%, so almost 90% of patients with stroke still remain apraxic 5 months, so 20 weeks post-assessment. This happens for different reasons. The main reason is that the therapists do not focus primarily on visual constructive apraxia from a neuropsychological point of view, and they prefer the wait-and-see approach. So they prefer the spontaneous resolution of the deficit. That not often happens, as it happens, for example, with other spatial deficits like spatial neglect. So the approach, as anticipated, we followed here, is an approach combining prismatic goggles, inducing a visual field deviation of 10 degrees, either to the right or to the left, depending on the orientation of the lenses, plus cognitive training. In this case, digital cognitive training through serious games. The logic of this approach has been tested in the past. It is a prime and train mechanism of action. Prime in the sense of neuromodulation priming. Prism adaptation has proven to be able to increase cortical excitability in the hemisphere ipsilateral to the visual field deviation. So right hemisphere when you deviate the visual field to the right and vice versa. And this opens a window of brain plasticity that can be exploited, leveraged by cognitive training, in this case, digital cognitive training. It is something that you know very well. We often pair neuromodulation with therapy. We speak about, for example, TMS for movement, TMS for language, TDCS for spasticity, and so on. So the logic is that one. But in this case, the neuromodulation is realized with prismatic goggles. In particular, in this paper reports the results of a pilot, a very pilot trial on 30 patients with these demographic characteristics. Patients with either right or left unilateral stroke, either ischemic or hemorrhagic. There was a problem in the randomization in this trial that you can see concerning education. The experimental group had a significantly lower education, so age of schools, basically school age, compared to the control group. So there was an advantage in this case for the control group from the cognitive point of view also. And you know how this is important for rehabilitation, especially for neuropsychological rehabilitation. The 30 patients were divided into two groups, a control group and an experimental group of 15 patients each. There was a baseline T0 assessment with a number of neuropsychological tests, including the figure copying test for assessing visual-constructive apraxia, and test for neglect, like the Albert cancellation test and the line bisection test, and test evaluating activities of daily living, like the Bartel test, frequently used in stroke patients. After these baseline assessments, the control and the experimental group were submitted to 10 sessions of daily physiotherapy plus cognitive rehabilitation. Standard cognitive rehabilitation for the control group, rehabilitation with Prism adaptation plus serious games for the experimental group. After these 10 days sessions, the patients were evaluated again at T1, so post-treatment. So this is basically something. Yesterday I tried for the first time this notebook LM for preparing slides. So if you see some strange slides, and it is, you know, it is related to the use of this experimental use of notebook LM. So anyway, this slide attempts to summarize again the logic of the trial. So subjects used prismatic adaptation, were submitted to prismatic adaptation, and they were requested to point to 60 random visual targets on a tablet at a fast rate using the ipsilational hand. And then the subjects removed the prisms, and the cognitive training through dynamic gaming, through serious games, started. So every session is composed by 60 pointing trials with prisms and 7 games, let's call the games, without prisms. This is a summary of the logic of the figure copying tasks. We used 2 figure copying tasks, the freehand copy of drawings, requiring patients to reproduce figures without any external cue, any external aid, while the copy of drawings with landmarks provides specific reference points to help patients planning and structuring the movements needed to copy the figure. So the second test, copy of drawings with landmarks, requires a combination of both spatial attention but also movement planning, more structured as compared to the freehand copy of drawings task. Let's go to the results. When looking at the simple test, figure coping without landmarks, both groups, so the control group represented in the left side in this slide, and the experimental group, right side, undergo improvement, a significant improvement, but without any significant difference between groups. So whether you applied standard rehabilitation or experimental rehabilitation using Prism plus serious games, both groups recovered at the same level. On the other hand, when looking at the task, at the visual constructive task requiring active spatial planning plus premotor planning, there was a divergence between the two groups. The experimental group, blue line, showed a significant improvement, also with a quite large effect size of 0.8, while the control group, the gray, almost gray line, remained stable. And in the right side of the slide, you can see, a representation of the drawings made by subjects, two representative subjects, in this case, right stroke and left stroke, after the treatment. Perhaps more importantly, as also observed in previous trials, looking at different cognitive abilities, there was a significant correlation between the improvement in the specific cognitive tasks, so in this case, visual constructive improvement, and improvement in daily life abilities. So the larger the improvements in the copy of drawings was, the larger the increase in the Bartel index was observed. And this was specific for the experimental black line, but not for the control group, gray line. So even if patients of the control group underwent some improvement, this improvement did not transfer in everyday life abilities. It is worth mentioning that the sections, the subsections of the Bartel index where the researchers noticed this improvement were the ones requiring the use of objects, like grooming, the use of a razor, for example, or a comb, dressing, eating. So tasks strictly related to the use of objects and so to visual construction abilities. Very often, clinicians and researchers are stuck on the idea that the Prism adaptation is something useful, only useful to modulate spatial neglect. This is true. This was the first application made by Yves Rossetti in 1991 and followed by many studies on that. Even in this study, patients were tested for neglect, the patients who had neglect, of course, using, as I said before, line bisection and Albert's line cancellation test. However, the results of this pilot trial showed that both control and experimental group patients improved in neglect scores after treatment. So there was not a special advantage of the prismatic goggles, at least for what concerns the line bisection test, while a greater advantage of the prismatic goggles group was observed for the Albert cancellation test. So again, a test where spatial attention needs to be integrated with movement planning to find out targets and cancel them in the space. But more importantly, the magnitude of neglect improvement was not correlated with the magnitude of visual construction improvements. So the results of this pilot trial suggest that the improvement of visual constructional abilities is probably related to a modulation of parieto-frontal circuits other than those involved in neglect. So the two cognitive abilities, spatial attention as measured with the neglect task on one side, and visual constructive abilities as tested with the figure copying task on the other side, proceed in parallel. In addition, finally, I would say, regression analysis tried to figure out which serious games are able to predict the improvement in visual constructive abilities. There was not a general and specific effect of all serious games on visual constructive improvement, but only the serious games with these strange names, Beware of the Bomb, the Café, Reverse Order, and Visual Search. So basically, the serious games targeting spatial attention plus movement planning, so the critical cognitive functions involved in visual constructive abilities are predictive of the clinical outcome. So, in sum, summarizing and concluding, we can say that this trial suggests that Prism are able to successfully prime the cortical network, opening a plasticity window that could be exploited for cognitive training. The advantage of such an approach is that it lasts only 10 sessions and that it combines in a single approach neuromodulation plus cognitive training. Last but not least, the point 4, it seems to be an approach, as confirmed also by other trials, other studies, that translates into ADL, so activities of daily living. So the improvements in the clinic in the neuropsychological tests directly correlate with improvements in daily living as tested with scales like Bartel Index. I stop here. Thank you for your attention. Open to discuss.